My name is Melissa Voss. I'm 42 years old, and for 6 years, I watched my daughter Lily live with pain that our own family insisted, over and over, was nothing, growing pains, attention-seeking, drama she'd learned from me. I started to believe them. I started to doubt what I could see with my own eyes. Then, this spring, a new specialist pulled Lily's entire medical chart, going back to when she was 8 years old, and found something none of us had ever put together on our own, a documented paper trail of exactly what my family had said to her doctors, for years, and exactly how much it had cost her. Her silent revenge stories. If you've ever had your own instincts about someone you love talked out of you by the people who were supposed to trust you most, comment "I've been there" below. This one's for you. Lily was 8 years old the first time she came to me complaining that her knees hurt badly enough that she didn't want to walk to the bus stop. I remember that particular morning clearly, mostly because of how ordinary it felt at the time, the kind of complaint I assumed, without much thought, was a passing thing, maybe a growth spurt, maybe she'd overdone it at recess the day before. Within a few months, the complaints had become a regular pattern rather than an occasional one. Her knees, then her wrists, then her hips, aching in ways that seemed to move around her body without any clear pattern I could identify. She'd wake up some mornings almost too stiff to get out of bed, loosening up gradually over the first hour or two of the day, only to grow exhausted again by early afternoon in a way that seemed disproportionate to anything an 8-year-old should reasonably be feeling. I took her to our pediatrician at the time, Dr. Reyes, who ran a standard set of blood work, found nothing dramatically abnormal, and offered the explanation that has followed my daughter for the better part of 6 years since: growing pains. A real, recognized phenomenon in children, he explained, usually benign, usually resolving on its own. I remember feeling reassured by that explanation, genuinely relieved, the way I imagine most parents are relieved by any explanation that doesn't require imagining something worse. I remember, too, the specific physical details of that first appointment in a way I've returned to often since: Lily sitting on the edge of the exam table in her socks, swinging her legs slightly, describing her knees as feeling like they're too tight, like someone squeezing them from the inside, a phrase I found oddly precise for an 8-year-old and that I mentioned to Dr. Reyes at the time. He nodded, wrote it down, and moved on to checking her range of motion, which came back within normal limits, a fact that seemed, at the time, to settle the question more definitively than it probably should have. I drove home that day already rehearsing, in my head, the explanation I'd give Lily, that her body was simply growing quickly, that this kind of ache was normal and would pass, that she didn't need to worry. I believed every word of it as I said it to her that evening, tucking her into bed. I think about that evening often now, the specific ease with which I passed along a reassurance I hadn't yet earned the right to be fully confident in. Over the following year, though, the pattern didn't resolve the way ordinary growing pains are supposed to. It shifted, instead, into something with more troubling texture, swelling in her fingers some mornings, bruising that appeared without any injury I could remember, a specific, deep fatigue that seemed to outpace anything a normal 9-year-old should be experiencing, even accounting for a busy school schedule and typical childhood exhaustion. I started keeping informal notes on my phone during this period, jotting down which joints hurt on which days, whether swelling accompanied the pain, how long her stiffness lasted each morning. Looking back at those notes now, years later, I'm struck by how clearly they document an emerging, consistent pattern, a pattern that, laid out in a simple list rather than experienced one scattered morning at a time, would have been much harder for anyone to dismiss as ordinary growing pains. At the time, though, I never thought to bring that list into an appointment, never thought to present it as evidence rather than simply mentioning individual episodes in passing. I brought these new details back to Dr. Reyes, who ran a slightly broader panel of blood work, found nothing conclusive again, and gently suggested that some children are simply more sensitive to ordinary aches and pains than others, and that anxiety, sometimes, can manifest physically in ways that mimic more serious conditions. He wasn't dismissive, exactly, not in the way people in my family would later become. But he also wasn't especially curious, and I think, looking back, I absorbed some of that same lack of urgency into my own instincts during those early years, in a way I've had to work hard to forgive myself for since. I want to be honest that I didn't push much harder, in that first year or two, than Dr. Reyes himself was pushing. I trusted him. I assumed a pediatrician's calm reassurance meant there was genuinely nothing more serious to worry about. What I didn't yet understand was how much that early, ambient calm, mine, and the pediatrician's, would go on to shape everything my extended family believed about Lily's pain for years afterward. There's a specific memory from that second year I still return to. Lily came home from a birthday party sleepover unable to lift her arm properly, wincing every time she reached for anything above shoulder height, and I remember calling the after-hours nurse line, describing the symptom, and being told, calmly, that unless there was clear swelling or an obvious injury, it was reasonable to simply monitor it overnight. By morning, the stiffness had mostly resolved, and I filed the episode away, the way I'd file away dozens of similar episodes over the following years, as one more isolated, unremarkable incident rather than one more data point in a pattern I wasn't yet allowing myself to see clearly. My husband, Daniel, comes from a large, close-knit family, his mother Carol, his father Ray, and 3 siblings, all of whom live within a 30-minute drive of each other and gather regularly for dinners, holidays, and a long-running Sunday tradition of everyone converging at Carol's house for an afternoon meal. I married into that closeness 11 years ago, and for the most part, I've genuinely valued it, even during the stretches when it also came with real friction. Carol, in particular, holds a specific, central authority within the family that I think matters enormously for understanding what happened over the following years. She raised 4 children largely on her own during a difficult stretch after Ray's early business failures, and she carries, as a result, a deeply held belief in a certain kind of stoicism, the conviction that most physical complaints, in children especially, are best met with brisk reassurance rather than what she often referred to, pointedly, as coddling. Daniel has told me, more than once over the years, stories from his own childhood that help explain where this conviction comes from. When he was 10, he broke his wrist falling off his bike and, according to family lore that Carol still tells with a certain pride, didn't tell anyone for 2 full days, playing through the pain because he didn't want to be a bother during a stretch when Carol was working double shifts and Ray was between jobs. That story, recounted at family gatherings as an example of Callahan family resilience, always struck me, even before Lily's diagnosis, as something closer to a warning sign than an achievement, a child learning, at 10 years old, to hide a genuine injury rather than risk being seen as a burden. I understand now, more clearly than I did before, how directly that same worldview shaped Carol's response to Lily's pain, decades later. I don't think Carol set out, at any point, to actively harm my daughter. I think, instead, she brought a specific, well-worn worldview to every conversation about Lily's pain, one shaped by her own childhood and her own experience raising 4 kids through genuine hardship without, as she frequently reminded us, falling apart over every little ache. That worldview, applied consistently and confidently over 6 years, by someone whose opinion carried enormous weight within the family, turned out to matter far more than I initially understood. The first specific comment I remember clearly came during a Sunday dinner when Lily was 9, not long after a particularly bad week where she'd missed 2 days of school due to pain and exhaustion. Carol, hearing about the missed school days, said, in the light, faintly amused tone she often used for observations she considered simply common sense, "You know, in my day, kids didn't get to stay home unless they had an actual fever. I think somebody's learned that complaining gets her out of things." I remember the specific sting of that comment, not just because it dismissed Lily's very real pain, but because of the pointed glance Carol gave me while saying it, a glance that made clear, without her needing to say it outright, that she considered the "complaining gets her out of things" pattern to be something Lily had learned from watching me, a mother Carol had, from early in our marriage, quietly regarded as somewhat overly anxious and overly indulgent. I want to describe that dinner in a little more detail, because the specific texture of it stayed with me for years. Lily had gone quiet at the table after Carol's comment, pushing food around her plate rather than eating, and I remember Daniel's father Ray, usually more reserved than Carol, adding his own brief agreement, "Kids these days do seem softer than we were," a comment that wasn't directed at Lily specifically but that landed, in that moment, as a kind of quiet confirmation that the entire table, not just Carol, had already settled into a shared skepticism I hadn't fully registered building until that dinner made it explicit. I pushed back, gently, that day, explaining that Lily's pediatrician hadn't found anything alarming but also hadn't dismissed the symptoms as fake. Carol's response was to nod in the specific, unconvinced way that told me the conversation was over as far as she was concerned, regardless of what I'd said. It was the first of what would become, over the following years, dozens of similar exchanges, each one small enough on its own to seem manageable, and each one contributing, in ways I didn't yet understand, to a much larger pattern. What I didn't fully register, in those early years, was how quickly Carol's specific framing of Lily's pain spread through the rest of the family, becoming, within a year or two, something close to a shared, unquestioned family consensus rather than simply one grandmother's private opinion. Daniel's sister Patricia, who has 3 kids of her own close in age to Lily, began making comments during family gatherings about how some kids just naturally gravitate toward being the center of attention, comments that were never phrased as direct accusations but that landed, every time, in the same specific place. I remember one particular instance, at Patricia's own daughter's birthday party, when Lily sat out a game of tag, holding her hip, and Patricia loudly announced to the other parents present that Lily gets these little episodes sometimes, in a tone light enough to sound almost affectionate but that I understood, watching Lily's face fall slightly, to be its own quiet form of dismissal delivered in front of an audience. Daniel's brother Mark, more bluntly, once told Lily directly, in front of the rest of the family, to walk it off when she mentioned her hip was bothering her during a family hike, a comment I remember watching land on my daughter's face in a way that made something in my chest tighten uncomfortably, even as I struggled, in the moment, to find the right words to intervene. Mark's own 2 sons, watching this exchange, absorbed the same lesson their father was modeling, and I noticed, over subsequent family gatherings, the cousins beginning to tease Lily gently about her fake injuries, a habit that felt, to a preteen already uncertain about her own body, considerably less gentle than it might have sounded to the adults who allowed it to continue. Daniel himself, I want to be honest, occupied a complicated middle position throughout most of this. He loved Lily deeply and never once directly dismissed her pain to her face. But he also, for years, seemed reluctant to push back firmly against his own mother's framing, a reluctance I understood, on some level, given the specific dynamics of his family, even as it left me feeling increasingly isolated in advocating for our daughter within a family that had, collectively, settled into a comfortable, shared skepticism. I want to describe, as honestly as I can, how this specific, sustained family pressure gradually reshaped my own instincts over those years, because I think it's the part of this story that matters most, and the part one find hardest to talk about. I didn't start out doubting Lily's pain. In the earliest years, I trusted what I saw plainly, a child who genuinely struggled some mornings, who genuinely seemed exhausted in ways that outpaced her peers, who genuinely wasn't the kind of child, in any other context, who reached for exaggeration or performance to get attention. But 6 years of consistent, confident pushback from an entire extended family, delivered by people I respected and loved, gradually wore down the certainty of that early trust in a way I didn't fully notice happening until much later, looking back. There were specific moments I still think about with real discomfort. A summer when Lily was 11, asking to skip a family reunion because her joints hurt too much to manage the long car ride, and me, exhausted from months of navigating Carol's skepticism, telling her, more sharply than I meant to, that she needed to push through it a little for the family's sake. I remember the specific look on her face in that moment, not anger, but a quiet, resigned kind of hurt, the look of a child registering that even her own mother had started, in some diminished way, to side with the doubt rather than with her. I remember another moment, smaller but no less painful in hindsight, from a school conference when Lily was 12. Her teacher mentioned, gently, that Lily seemed to be missing gym class more often than her classmates and asked whether everything was all right at home. I remember answering, almost automatically, that Lily tends to exaggerate minor aches sometimes, a phrase I recognize now as almost a direct echo of something Patricia had said at a family dinner weeks earlier, evidence, in a way that still unsettles me, of how thoroughly my family's framing had worked its way into my own vocabulary, deployed without my even consciously choosing those specific words. I want to be honest that this is the part of the story I've had to do the most difficult reckoning with since. I don't think I ever consciously decided to believe my family over my daughter. But the sustained, confident weight of that many voices, over that many years, did something quieter and more insidious than an outright decision. It simply, gradually, made me a less reliable advocate than I should have been, at exactly the moments Lily needed one most. There's one specific incident from when Lily was 11 that I return to more than almost any other, because I think it represents, as clearly as anything, the real cost of the doubt that had accumulated by that point. At a routine checkup, a nurse practitioner filling in for Dr. Reyes that day, someone I'd never met before and would never see again, looked over Lily's history more closely than any single previous visit had, noted the specific pattern of joint pain, fatigue, and unexplained bruising spanning several years, and suggested, somewhat urgently, that we consider a referral to a pediatric rheumatologist, mentioning, specifically, that this particular combination of symptoms was sometimes associated with connective tissue disorders that benefit enormously from early diagnosis and management. I remember her name, even now, nurse practitioner Talia Odom, and I remember the specific way she flipped back through pages of Lily's chart, visibly building a mental timeline as she went, in a way that felt different from the more surface-level reviews I'd grown used to from Dr. Reyes's rushed 15-minute appointments. I'm seeing a pattern here that goes back further than I think anyone's fully connected, she told me, tapping the chart. Individually, each of these visits might look like something minor. Together, over 4 years, this looks like something worth a specialist's closer look. I remember feeling a genuine jolt of validation hearing that suggestion, the first time, in 3 years, that a medical professional had proposed something more specific than growing pains or vague reassurance. I left that appointment with a referral form in hand, genuinely intending to follow through. What actually happened, over the following weeks, is something I've thought about with real regret ever since. I mentioned the referral to Carol during a Sunday dinner, expecting, perhaps naively, that a doctor's specific recommendation might finally shift her thinking. Instead, she reacted with visible skepticism, questioning whether a fill-in nurse really had the standing to override years of Dr. Reyes's more measured assessment, and suggesting, pointedly, that specialists have a financial incentive to find something wrong with every child who walks through their door. I remember trying to counter that specific argument, pointing out that Nurse Odom hadn't been vague or alarmist, that she'd specifically referenced a documented pattern spanning years rather than a single visit's impression. Carol's response was to bring up a cousin of hers whose child had been put through all kinds of unnecessary tests years earlier for a condition that, in her retelling, turned out to be nothing, a story I now recognize as almost certainly missing significant context, but that landed, at the dinner table that evening, as a persuasive cautionary tale nonetheless. Daniel, present for that conversation, didn't push back firmly, and I, worn down by that point from years of similar exchanges, let the referral quietly lapse rather than following through on an appointment I genuinely intended to make just weeks earlier. I remember the referral form itself sitting on our kitchen counter for nearly a month, moved from pile to pile as other mail accumulated around it, until it eventually ended up, unfiled and unused, in a drawer where I wouldn't find it again until Dr. Nasser's office asked for our prior records years later. I wish I could say that referral lapse was an isolated mistake, a single moment of weakness I corrected soon afterward. It wasn't. Over the following 3 years, a similar pattern repeated itself more than once, a new symptom emerging, a flicker of my own concern rising, a conversation with Carol or another family member that gradually talked me back down into a more manageable, less urgent framing of what I was seeing. I think of a specific stretch when Lily was 12, a winter where she developed a rash across both forearms alongside an unusually severe flare of joint pain, prominent enough that I scheduled an appointment with Dr. Reyes specifically to raise the possibility of an autoimmune condition, a term I'd started researching quietly on my own. Carol, hearing about the upcoming appointment, offered to come along for support, and once there, steered much of the conversation toward Lily's diet and screen time habits rather than the rash and joint pain I'd intended to focus on, a redirection Dr. Reyes, perhaps out of simple politeness, allowed to shape much of the visit. I left that appointment with a recommendation to monitor and journal, rather than any further testing, and I remember feeling, even then, a flicker of frustration I didn't fully act on. Lily, throughout this stretch, adapted in the specific, quiet way I think children often do when the adults around them collectively minimize something real. She stopped mentioning her pain as openly as she once had, learning, I think, that raising it too often within earshot of extended family invited exactly the kind of comments that made her feel worse rather than better. She became skilled, in a way that still breaks my heart to describe, at pushing through school days on her worst mornings, at joining family activities even when her joints were clearly bothering her, at performing a kind of resilience that I now understand was costing her far more than any of us, including me, fully appreciated at the time. I remember, specifically, a Christmas morning when Lily was 13, watching her carefully arrange herself on the couch in a position that minimized strain on her hip before any of the extended family arrived, a small, practiced adjustment I noticed but didn't think much of at the time, not yet understanding it as evidence of exactly how much quiet, constant self-management she'd already learned to do entirely on her own, without any of us truly seeing it. By the time Lily was 13, she'd developed a noticeable limp on her worst days, a detail that even Carol could no longer entirely wave away, though her explanation shifted, by that point, towards suggesting Lily was simply not stretching enough or spending too much time on her phone instead of being active, explanations that continued to place the responsibility for her symptoms on Lily's own habits rather than considering, seriously, that something more significant might be happening in her body. The specific turning point in this story arrived last winter, when Lily, then 14, woke up one morning unable to fully straighten her right knee, a swelling severe enough and sudden enough that even I, dulled as my instincts had become over the preceding years, understood immediately that this was different from anything we'd seen before. I remember that morning in granular detail, Lily calling out from her room in a voice that carried real fear rather than her usual, practiced stoicism, the specific heat radiating off her knee when I touched it, the way her face had gone pale and clammy in a manner that overrode, instantly, every year of accumulated doubt I'd absorbed from my family. Whatever else I'd let myself be talked out of over the preceding 6 years, I didn't hesitate that morning. I had her in the car within 15 minutes. I took her to urgent care that same morning, where a physician's assistant, alarmed by the degree of swelling and the specific warmth radiating from the joint, ordered immediate imaging and blood work, and referred us, this time with real urgency behind the paperwork, to a pediatric rheumatologist at the regional children's hospital, insisting we be seen within the week rather than the usual multi-month waiting period. I remember sitting in that urgent care waiting room, watching Lily wince every time she shifted her weight, and feeling something crack open in me that had been slowly closing over for years, a specific, overwhelming wave of guilt and clarity arriving at once, the recognition that whatever this was, it had very likely been building, unaddressed, for far longer than this single acute flare-up suggested. I remember, too, calling Daniel from that waiting room, my voice breaking in a way it hadn't in years, telling him plainly, for the first time, that I thought we'd made a serious mistake by not pushing harder, sooner. The pediatric rheumatologist we were referred to, Dr. Amina Nasser, turned out to be exactly the kind of physician Lily needed years earlier, thorough, unhurried, and, from our very first appointment, genuinely curious about the full arc of Lily's history rather than treating the current flare-up as an isolated event. Dr. Nasser spent nearly 90 minutes with us at that first appointment, an amount of time I'd never experienced with any previous doctor, walking through Lily's symptoms year by year, asking detailed questions about patterns I'd almost forgotten myself, the specific joints affected, the timing of the fatigue, the bruising, a detail about Lily's unusually flexible joints that I'd always assumed was simply a harmless quirk rather than a potential clinical clue. I remember, partway through that appointment, Dr. Nasser asking Lily to demonstrate how far she could bend her thumb back toward her wrist, a simple test that Lily performed with an ease that visibly registered on Dr. Nasser's face, not alarm, exactly, but the specific, focused attention of someone recognizing a meaningful clinical sign rather than an unremarkable party trick. "How long have you been able to do that?" she asked. Lily shrugged. "Since I can remember. I used to show my friends at school." I remember the specific, quiet realization settling over me in that moment, that a detail I'd genuinely never thought twice about had, apparently, been a visible clue this whole time, one nobody, including me, had ever thought to mention to a doctor as potentially significant. She ordered a comprehensive set of tests, including genetic testing and detailed imaging, and requested, with our consent, Lily's complete medical records going back to her earliest pediatric visits, a request I didn't think much of at the time, beyond the ordinary administrative hassle of tracking down years of scattered records from Dr. Reyes's office. 3 weeks later, Dr. Nasser called us in for a follow-up appointment and delivered a diagnosis that reframed, in a single conversation, nearly everything our family had spent 6 years dismissing: hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, a genetic connective tissue disorder affecting the strength and stability of joints, skin, and blood vessels throughout the body. She explained, carefully and patiently, exactly what this meant: that Lily's joints were, quite literally, more prone to instability and injury than a typical child's, that the fatigue was a well-documented, genuine feature of the condition rather than a behavioral pattern, that the bruising was consistent with the fragile connective tissue the condition affects, and that the specific combination of symptoms we'd been describing for years fit the diagnostic picture almost textbook perfectly. I remember watching Lily's face during that explanation, a specific mixture of relief and something closer to grief crossing it as Dr. Nasser spoke. Relief, I think, at finally having a name for what she'd been carrying alone for so long, and grief, perhaps, for the years spent doubting her own experience of her own body. She asked one question, quietly, partway through: "Does this mean I wasn't making it up? Like, actually, medically, does this prove that?" Dr. Nasser answered without hesitation. "It absolutely does. What you've been feeling has a real, physical, measurable cause. You were never making anything up. This is not a condition that develops overnight," Dr. Nasser told us. "Based on what I'm seeing, and based on the history you've described, I'd estimate Lily has likely had this condition since birth, with symptoms becoming clinically significant somewhere around the age you first noticed the knee pain, at 8 years old. I want to be honest with you both, earlier diagnosis, even by a few years, generally allows us to implement physical therapy and joint protection strategies that meaningfully reduce the kind of cumulative joint damage I'm already seeing some early signs of in her imaging." At that same appointment, Dr. Nasser mentioned something that initially struck me as a minor administrative detail, before it grew, over the following weeks, into something far more significant. She explained that in reviewing Lily's full medical history, going back to Dr. Reyes's earliest notes, she'd noticed a recurring pattern documented directly in the chart, several visit notes over the years that referenced, specifically, family members present during appointments expressing skepticism about the severity or legitimacy of Lily's symptoms. I remember asking her, somewhat surprised, whether it was typical for a doctor to document that kind of family dynamic at all. She explained that it's more common than people realize, particularly for pediatricians managing hard-to-diagnose, chronic complaints, precisely because family attitudes can meaningfully shape how consistently a child's symptoms get reported and pursued over time. "Doctors notice these patterns," she said. "We don't always act on them as forcefully as we probably should, but we do notice, and we write it down. I want to be clear that this isn't unusual, unfortunately," she said. Family skepticism toward chronic, hard-to-diagnose conditions like this is extremely common, especially in children, and especially with a condition like EDS that doesn't always show up clearly on standard blood work. But I do think it's worth understanding, as a family, how much that skepticism appears to have shaped the pace of Lily's diagnosis over the years, because I think it's important for moving forward in a healthier way. She offered, somewhat carefully, to walk us through the specific notes if we wanted, explaining that she thought it might be clarifying, both for us and for Lily, to understand exactly how the pattern had accumulated over time, documented in real time by doctors who had, themselves, noted the family dynamics playing out in their exam rooms. I asked Dr. Nasser to walk me through it, and what she pulled up, over the course of that appointment, was more specific and more sobering than I'd expected. Dr. Reyes's notes from Lily's 9th-year checkup, the one following the first Sunday dinner comment from Carol, included a brief, clinical line: "Grandmother present during visit, expressed strong opinion that symptoms are exaggerated, family appears divided on significance of complaints." A note from the visit when Lily was 11, the same year the fill-in nurse practitioner had proposed the rheumatology referral, included a follow-up note from several months later, presumably added when the referral appointment was never scheduled. Referral to pediatric rheumatology recommended. Date: no record of appointment scheduled or completed as of 6-month follow-up. Parent reports family reluctance regarding specialist evaluation. There was a third note, from when Lily was 12, documenting a visit where she'd come in alone with me, without extended family present, in which Dr. Reyes had written, "Patient notably more forthcoming about symptom severity in this visit compared to prior visits with extended family present. Consider whether family dynamics may be influencing patients' willingness to report symptoms accurately." I remember sitting with my own copy of these 3 notes afterward, reading them over multiple times, struck by how clinical and understated the language was, and how much weight that understated language actually carried. Nobody in those notes used dramatic language. Nobody wrote anything resembling an accusation. And yet, laid end to end, the 3 notes told an unmistakable, cumulative story, a doctor who had noticed, more than once, a pattern significant enough to comment on directly, and who had, each time, apparently decided it wasn't quite his place to push the family harder than he did. I sat with that particular note for a long time after Dr. Nasser showed it to me. A doctor, years earlier, had noticed exactly the pattern I was only now fully reckoning with, that Lily herself had learned, gradually, to underreport her own pain specifically because of how her family responded to it, a pattern documented in real time by a physician who, I now understood with painful clarity, had noticed something significant and never pushed hard enough, and that I had never pushed hard enough either, to act on it. I brought all of this home to Daniel that evening, laying out what Dr. Nasser had shown me as plainly as I could manage. I want to describe his reaction honestly, because it wasn't defensive in the way I might have braced for. He sat quietly for a long time after I finished, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a specific weight I hadn't heard from him in all our years together. I remember him picking up his phone at one point, scrolling back through old family group chat messages, searching, I think, for evidence of his own complicity that he half hoped he wouldn't find. He found it anyway, a message from 3 years earlier, in response to my mentioning the lapsed referral, where he'd written simply, "Mom's probably right that we don't need to overreact." He read that message out loud to me, his voice flat, and then set the phone down without saying anything else for a long moment. "I think some part of me always knew this was possible," he said. "I just didn't want to be the one who had to say it out loud, especially not about my own mother. It felt easier to let it be ambiguous, to tell myself we were just being appropriately cautious rather than dismissive. I think I let that ambiguity protect me from a harder conversation I should have started years ago." I told him, honestly, that I understood that instinct, because I recognized a version of it in myself, the specific, human tendency to avoid a difficult confrontation with people you love by simply not looking too closely at the cost of staying quiet. But I also told him, plainly, that whatever discomfort either of us felt about confronting his family was, by any reasonable measure, smaller than what Lily had already been carrying for 6 years on her own. We told the wider family about Lily's diagnosis at the next Sunday dinner, a conversation I'd approached with real anxiety, unsure how Carol in particular would respond to a diagnosis that, in effect, validated everything she'd spent years dismissing. Carol's initial reaction was quieter than I expected, a long pause, followed by a somewhat clipped acknowledgement that it was good to finally have an answer, delivered in a tone that didn't yet fully register, as far as I could tell, the specific role her own years of skepticism had played in delaying that answer. Patricia, similarly, offered a brief, somewhat deflecting comment about how these things are hard to diagnose anyway, a framing that conveniently left out the specific years of family pushback that had discouraged us from pursuing the specialist evaluation that might have caught it sooner. I didn't push the deeper reckoning that evening, partly because I didn't yet feel emotionally prepared for it myself, and partly because I sensed, correctly as it turned out, that the fuller weight of what had actually happened wouldn't fully land until it came from someone with more direct authority on the subject than me. About 3 weeks later, Carol called a family meeting of her own, not, as I initially assumed, to further process Lily's diagnosis in a spirit of reflection, but, as became clear once we arrived, to address what she described, somewhat defensively, as all this talk going around that the family somehow caused this. Patricia had apparently mentioned, to Carol, a conversation she'd overheard between Daniel and me, and Carol, sensing an implicit accusation building within the family, wanted the chance to address it directly, on her own terms, before it went any further. I want to describe the specific tone of that meeting honestly, because it wasn't an apology, or even really an attempt at genuine reflection. Carol opened by acknowledging, briefly, that Lily's diagnosis was clearly a real thing, before pivoting quickly into a defense of her own past skepticism, reminding everyone present that she'd raised 4 children through genuine hardship without the benefit of all these modern diagnoses, and suggesting that her caution over the years had come from love and experience, not from any real intent to dismiss Lily's suffering. Daniel, to his credit, pushed back at that point more directly than I'd ever heard him push back against his mother before. "I don't think anyone's questioning that you loved her," he said. "But there's a difference between caution and actively discouraging us from seeing a specialist." That happened. More than once. And I think we need to actually sit with that instead of explaining it away. At a subsequent family appointment, this one specifically requested by Carol herself, who'd asked, somewhat surprisingly, whether she could speak with Dr. Nasser directly to understand the medical side of things better, Dr. Nasser agreed to a joint conversation with Carol, Daniel, Lily, and me present. I want to be honest that I wasn't entirely sure what to expect from that meeting, or whether it was a good idea at all. But Dr. Nasser, once the appointment began, handled the conversation with a specific, careful directness that neither dodged the difficult history nor turned the meeting into an outright confrontation. She began by explaining the medical facts of Lily's condition in clear, accessible terms, walking Carol through exactly why a genetic connective tissue disorder like hypermobile EDS doesn't behave the way ordinary growing pains do, and why the specific combination of symptoms Lily had displayed for years, the joint instability, the fatigue, the bruising, represented a coherent, recognizable clinical picture rather than a collection of unrelated, exaggerated complaints. It was partway through that explanation that Dr. Nasser, without being asked to and without any real prompting from Daniel or me, addressed the documented history directly, in a moment that has stayed with all of us since. "I want to share something with you, Carol, that I think is important," she said, her tone measured but unmistakably clear. "In reviewing Lily's chart, I found several notes, going back years, documenting specific family skepticism about her symptoms, including, at one point, a recommended specialist referral that was never followed up on, in a note that specifically references family reluctance as a factor. I'm not sharing this to assign blame in a punitive way. Family skepticism toward invisible, hard-to-diagnose conditions is genuinely common, and I don't think anyone in this room set out to hurt Lily. But I do think it's important for you to understand, directly, that this wasn't just an internal family disagreement without real consequences. There's a documented, several-year gap between when a medical professional first suggested a specialist evaluation and when Lily actually received one. That gap has real, measurable costs. Some of the joint damage I'm seeing in her imaging now is more advanced than I'd expect to see if she'd been properly diagnosed and treated even 2 or 3 years earlier." The room went quiet in a way I don't think any of us fully anticipated. Carol, for the first time since we'd told her about the diagnosis, didn't have a ready response. Carol sat with that for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a different quality than it had in any previous conversation about Lily's pain, quieter, and considerably less certain. "I didn't know it was in the chart," she said, eventually. "I didn't think anyone was writing down what I said in the room. I just thought I was being, I don't know, sensible, practical. The way my own mother would have handled something like this." She paused again, looking, for the first time in this entire story, genuinely uncertain rather than confidently dismissive. "I don't think I understood that my opinion carried that much actual weight in what you all decided to do. I thought I was just one voice at a dinner table." Dr. Nasser, gently but without softening the underlying point, responded, "In my experience, the opinions of people families trust and respect carry an enormous amount of weight, especially around symptoms that are hard to see or measure objectively. That's not a criticism of you personally. It's just something worth understanding clearly, going forward, given how much influence that kind of voice can actually have." Lily, who'd stayed mostly quiet through the earlier parts of that appointment, spoke up toward the end, in a moment I hadn't anticipated and that I think surprised everyone in the room, including Dr. Nasser. "I stopped telling people when it hurt," she said, looking mostly at the floor rather than at any of us directly. "Not just at family stuff. Sometimes at school, too. I got so used to people not believing me that I just started assuming nobody would, so there wasn't really a point saying anything unless it got really bad." She looked up, briefly, at Carol. "I used to think maybe you were right, that I was making it a bigger deal than it actually was. I spent a long time thinking that about myself. I don't think anything in that entire meeting landed with quite the same weight as those 2 sentences from my 14-year-old daughter, describing, plainly, the specific psychological cost of 6 years spent being doubted by the people who were supposed to protect her." Carol, hearing this, was visibly moved in a way I hadn't seen from her before, tears forming that she made no attempt to hide. I don't want to describe what happened in the weeks following that appointment as some instant, complete transformation in Carol, or in the wider family's approach to Lily's condition, because I don't think that would be honest. Old patterns, especially ones reinforced over years by an entire family system, don't dissolve in a single difficult conversation, however clarifying that conversation might be. But something did shift, concretely, in the months that followed. Carol began asking genuine, informed questions about Lily's treatment plan rather than offering skeptical commentary, going so far as to attend one of Lily's physical therapy sessions to better understand what the daily management of the condition actually involved. Patricia, similarly, reached out directly to apologize for her own years of dismissive comments, acknowledging that she'd taken her cues largely from Carol without ever independently questioning whether that framing was fair to Lily. Mark, Daniel's brother, offered a more halting, less complete acknowledgement, still occasionally slipping into old habits of minimizing, though noticeably less often than before, and with visible self-correction when Daniel or I gently flagged it. Medically, Lily's care has changed substantially since the diagnosis. She now works with a physical therapist who specializes in joint protection strategies specifically designed for hypermobility disorders, has been fitted with supportive braces for her most affected joints, and has learned, with Dr. Nasser's guidance, a set of pacing strategies designed to manage her energy levels in a way that reduces the severe flare-ups that used to blindside her without warning. I want to be honest that the diagnosis hasn't been a simple, complete solution. Ehlers-Danlos syndrome is a lifelong condition without a cure, and Lily will need to manage it, in various forms, for the rest of her life. But the difference between managing a well-understood, properly diagnosed condition and struggling silently against an unnamed, doubted one has been enormous, both for her physical trajectory and for something harder to measure but equally important, her sense of being genuinely believed, finally, by the people closest to her. I want to close this story by being honest about the part I found hardest to sit with throughout all of this, not Carol's years of skepticism, which I've largely made peace with, understanding it as a genuine, if deeply costly, product of her own history and worldview, but my own gradual erosion as Lily's primary advocate during exactly the years she needed one most. I've thought a great deal, since the diagnosis, about why I let that specialist referral lapse when Lily was 11, why I told her to push through it before that family reunion, why 6 years of my own direct, daily observation of my daughter's genuine suffering slowly became less certain than the confident, repeated skepticism of people who saw her only occasionally, at family gatherings, rather than in the quiet, unwitnessed moments when her pain was most visible to me alone. What I've come to understand, in the months since, is that sustained social pressure, even well-intentioned pressure from people who genuinely love you, can wear down even direct, first-hand certainty in ways that are difficult to notice happening in real time. I don't think I'm a uniquely gullible or weak-willed person for having experienced that erosion. I think it's a specific, human vulnerability that a lot of parents, especially those embedded in large, opinionated family systems, likely experience in some form, whether the specific issue is a medical condition or something else entirely. If I could go back and tell my younger self one thing, standing in that pediatrician's office 6 years ago, it would be this: a doctor's calm reassurance is worth listening to, but it isn't the only signal that matters. And neither is the confident skepticism of people who see your child only occasionally. The person with the clearest, most consistent view of a child's actual daily experience is almost always the parent who's present for the ordinary, unwitnessed mornings, not the extended family members offering opinions from the outside, however confidently those opinions are delivered. I'd also tell myself, plainly, that a single specialist referral, followed through promptly rather than allowed to quietly lapse under social pressure, likely would have changed the entire trajectory of the 6 years that followed, not just medically, in terms of the joint damage that might have been prevented, but psychologically, in terms of how much earlier Lily might have learned that her own perception of her own body could be trusted, rather than spending some of her most formative years learning the opposite lesson instead. The family that gathers at Carol's house on Sundays now looks, on the surface, much the same as it always has. But underneath that surface, something specific and lasting has shifted. Lily's pain, when she mentions it now, is met with genuine, informed concern rather than skepticism dressed up as common sense. Carol, in particular, has become, somewhat to my ongoing surprise, one of the more attentive members of the family when it comes to accommodating Lily's specific physical needs, remembering, without being asked, to choose lower-impact activities during family outings, checking in privately with Lily about how she's feeling in a way she never used to. I don't think any of this fully undoes the 6 years that came before it. Lily still carries some joint damage that Dr. Nasser believes could have been meaningfully reduced with earlier intervention, and she still carries, I suspect, some quieter psychological residue from years spent doubting her own perception of her own pain. But I've watched her, over these past several months, gradually relearn something I think she'd started to lose sometime around age 11 or 12, the basic, foundational trust that when something in her body feels genuinely wrong, she's allowed to say so, clearly and without apology, and be believed. I still love my husband's family, complicated as that love has become in the wake of everything this story describes. I understand, more fully now than I did even a year ago, that Carol's years of skepticism came from a specific, sincerely held worldview rather than any real desire to see her granddaughter suffer. But I no longer extend that understanding the same unquestioning deference I once did, and I no longer allow anyone else's confidence about my daughter's body to outweigh my own direct, careful observation of it. I've learned, in the hardest possible way, that a child's pain doesn't require an entire family's consensus to be real, and that sometimes the clearest, most necessary correction to a years-long pattern doesn't come from a difficult conversation at a dinner table at all. It comes from someone with the specific authority and the specific documentation to simply lay the truth out plainly, in a room full of people who'd spent years finding ways not to look at it directly. If you've ever had your own instincts about someone you love slowly worn down by people who meant well but got it badly wrong, I'd love to hear how it happened, and what it took to trust yourself again. Let me know in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one coming every week.